You're being judged for a crime your species hasn't even committed yet. The voice echoed across the Galactic Council chamber, sharp and cold, as Ethan Carter stood alone beneath a ceiling of shifting lights and silent observers. Every step he had taken to get here felt heavier than gravity itself, yet his posture remained steady, shoulders squared, hands relaxed at his sides. Around him, beings of countless forms watched from elevated platforms, their eyes, sensors, and bioluminescent patterns fixed on the human standing at the center. To them, he was an anomaly. To them, humanity was a problem to be solved. Ethan's gaze moved slowly, deliberately, meeting each set of alien eyes without hesitation. He wasn't here to impress them. He wasn't here to beg. He was here because Earth had been summoned, and he was the one who answered. The lead counselor leaned forward, its voice resonating through the chamber like shifting stone. Human representative, your species has been evaluated across centuries of observation. The results are concerning. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, he took a small step forward, the soft sound of his shoe against the floor echoing louder than expected. The chamber reacted, not with movement, but with attention. You stand before the Galactic Council, another voice added. A gathering that has preserved order among stars for millions of cycles. And yet your species continues to deviate from acceptable parameters. Ethan finally spoke, his voice calm, grounded, unmistakably human. You're measuring us like we're finished. A ripple passed through the council, subtle but unmistakable. Are you not? The lead counselor asked. Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes lowering for just a moment before lifting again, sharper now, more focused. No, he said. Because we're not done. The word lingered, hanging in the air, challenging the stillness itself. Around him, faint murmurs began to stir, like distant wind through metal corridors. Ethan's voice remained steady, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something unyielding. You see our wars, our failures, our mistakes, and you think that defines us. He paused, letting the silence settle. But you don't see what happens after. A subtle shift rippled through the chamber. Some observers leaned in slightly. Others remained rigid, calculating. You don't see the rebuilding, Ethan continued. The second chances. The moments when we choose to stand up again. His hands remained still, but his presence seemed to expand, as if the weight of his words carried more mass than the man himself. The council remained silent, waiting, measuring, watching. Then Ethan took a final step forward, closing the distance between himself and the unknown. If you're here to judge humanity, he said quietly, then you're already too late to understand it. The chamber went still, completely still, and in that moment, something ancient, something beyond protocol, began to shift. The silence did not break. It deepened. Ethan Carter stood still at the center of the Galactic Council chamber, his breath slow, controlled, as if he were anchoring himself to something unseen. Around him, the alien observers shifted subtly, their forms illuminated by faint pulses of light that rippled across their bodies like thoughts made visible. No one spoke. No one interrupted. The weight of his last words still lingered in the air, pressing against the edges of the room like gravity that refused to release its hold. Then, at last, the lead counselor moved. A slow, deliberate motion, its elongated form rising slightly, as if recalibrating its presence. You claim your species is not defined by its failures, it said, voice measured, almost clinical. Then explain your record. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the floor beneath him, polished and reflective, catching the faint image of himself. A man, one among billions. Not special, not chosen, just present. Records do not define intention, he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. They only record what has already happened. A faint shift passed through the chamber. The counselors exchanged subtle glances, some visible, others conveyed through pulses of light or slight movements of their limbs. One of them leaned forward, its form angular and precise. Intention is irrelevant if the outcome leads to instability. Ethan raised his gaze again, meeting that speaker directly. Then you have misunderstood humanity. The words were simple, direct, but they carried something more. A challenge, perhaps, or something deeper. We do not claim perfection, he continued. We never have, but we do not stop trying to improve. The chamber remained still, but not silent now. There was a tension in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the moment before a storm. Your species has repeatedly demonstrated cycles of conflict, another counselor stated, each followed by periods of reconstruction. Yet the pattern repeats. Ethan nodded once. That is true. No denial. No resistance. The honesty seemed to ripple through the room more strongly than any argument. Then why should this council allow your species to continue without intervention? The lead counselor asked. Ethan paused again, not in hesitation, but in thought. He let the silence stretch, letting them sit in it. Then he spoke, his voice quieter now, but carrying more weight than before. Because we are the only species that learns from what we break. The words hung there, suspended. Around him, the council reacted in subtle ways. A flicker of light, a shift in posture, a tightening of stillness. That is not evidence, the counselor responded. That is belief. Ethan gave a slight nod. Then test it. That single suggestion changed the temperature of the room. Not physically, but perceptibly. You claim humanity is unstable, Ethan continued. Then observe us. Not as we were. Not as we are at our worst. But as we become. The lead counselor's eyes narrowed, though the gesture carried no hostility. Only evaluation. And what exactly are you offering? Ethan took a breath, steady and grounded. A chance. The chamber grew quiet again. But this time, it was different. Not empty. Not judgmental. Just uncertain. And in that uncertainty, something began to shift. Not in the room, but in the way they were beginning to look at him. The word chance echoed in the chamber like a signal no one had expected. Ethan Carter stood where he was, still, grounded, as if the floor itself had become the only thing keeping him connected to reality. Around him, the Galactic Council remained motionless, their collective attention locked onto a single human offering something that did not fit within their calculations. A chance was not a variable they could easily quantify. It was unpredictable. It introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty, in their framework, was dangerous. The lead counselor shifted, its elongated form casting a faint, shifting shadow across the polished surface below. You propose that we observe your species, it said, voice controlled, precise. Under what conditions? Ethan did not hesitate. Under your oversight. Your parameters. Your environment. He paused, then added, but not your assumptions. A ripple moved through the chamber again. Subtle, controlled, but present. You are aware, another counselor interjected, that your species has repeatedly failed under similar observation attempts in the past. Ethan nodded once. Then you have been observing the wrong moments. Silence followed. That statement. Not a complete silence, but one that held weight. The kind that demanded attention. The kind that forced thought. Ethan continued, his voice steady, but carrying something quieter beneath it. You look at us when we are at our worst. When fear drives us. When pressure distorts us. When survival narrows our choices. He lifted his gaze slightly, meeting the council directly. But that is not the full measure of a species. A soft pulse of light flickered across one of the council members, as if reacting to something internal. Another shifted position, subtle but noticeable. And what is the full measure of humanity? The lead counselor asked. Ethan took a breath, then answered simply. What we choose to do when no one forces us to. The chamber grew still again. But this time, the stillness felt different. Less like judgment. More like listening. You speak of choice, the counselor said. But your history shows repeated cycles of destructive behavior. How do you reconcile that? Ethan's expression did not change. He had expected this. We do not deny our history, he said. We study it. We learn from it. And we try again. The phrase landed softly, but its meaning spread outward. Slowly. Try again, one of the counselors repeated, almost as if testing the sound of the words. Ethan gave a slight nod. Every time. A pause followed. Not empty. Not meaningless. But reflective. Your species demonstrates persistence, the lead counselor said. But persistence alone does not ensure stability. Ethan stepped forward just slightly, closing the distance by a fraction. No, he agreed. But it ensures possibility. That word lingered. Possibility. A concept that resisted certainty. A concept that could not be fully controlled. Around the chamber, the observers remained silent, yet their stillness felt different now. Less rigid. More attentive. Ethan could feel it. The shift. Not in power. Not yet. But but in perception. If we allow observation, the counselor said finally, we must define what success looks like. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at them, all of them, one by one. Then he spoke, his voice calm, deliberate. Success is not perfection. A pause. It is progress. Another pause. Measured not by what we avoid, but by what we overcome. The chamber absorbed his words. And for the first time since he entered, the Galactic Council did not respond immediately. They did not challenge. They did not dismiss. They considered. And in that moment, Ethan Carter stood not as a subject under judgment, but as something else entirely. Something that had introduced a variable no calculation had prepared for. And somewhere, deep within the silence of that vast chamber, the idea of humanity began to shift. The chamber did not move, but something within it had changed. Ethan Carter remained standing at the center, yet the weight around him felt different now, as if the air itself had begun to acknowledge his presence in a new way. The Galactic Council observed him with a level of attention that had shifted from judgment to curiosity. Not agreement, not trust, but something closer to consideration. The lead counselor extended a subtle motion, and the chamber's ambient lighting adjusted slightly, casting softer tones across the polished surfaces. Human representative, it began. Your proposal for observation has been noted. Ethan gave a slight nod, acknowledging the acknowledgement without pressing for more. We will proceed under controlled parameters, the counselor continued. Your species will be monitored through a series of observational sequences. Non-interference will be enforced unless critical instability is detected. Ethan remained still. Understood, he said simply. There was no celebration in his voice. No relief. Only acceptance. Your role in this process, the counselor added, will remain under evaluation. Ethan met its gaze. That is fair. The council chamber seemed to breathe again, though no visible mechanism suggested such a thing. Around them, the other council members began to adjust their positions, some turning slightly, others projecting faint pulses of light that suggested internal communication. The decision had not unified them. It had divided them into quiet streams of thought. Ethan could feel it. The shift was no longer just in the room. It was in them. You will be assigned a designated observer, another counselor stated. A representative from the Galactic Oversight Division. Ethan nodded once. That makes sense. They will assess your behavior, your species patterns, and your adherence to claimed values. Ethan responded calmly. Then they will see what we choose to show. A faint pause followed. Or what you cannot hide, the counselor replied. Ethan did not argue. He simply accepted the possibility. Around the chamber, a subtle energy began to build as systems activated in preparation for the next phase. Ethan felt it, like a quiet hum beneath his feet, like distant machinery awakening. Your environment will be replicated, the counselor continued. A controlled simulation based on your planetary conditions. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. You are recreating Earth? Not entirely, the counselor responded. Only the variables necessary for observation. Ethan exhaled softly. Then it will not be Earth. The counselor did not respond immediately. It will be sufficient, it said after a moment. Ethan nodded once. Sufficient for observation, he said. Not for understanding. That statement lingered. Not challenged. Not dismissed. Just present. A few of the council members shifted again, their attention subtly realigning. One of them, positioned slightly apart from the rest, emitted a slower, more thoughtful pattern of light. It had not spoken much, but it was watching Ethan differently now. Your species places value on resilience, it said quietly. Ethan turned slightly toward it. We place value on effort, he replied. Resilience is what remains when effort is tested. The chamber fell into a contemplative stillness. Ethan stood there, grounded in that stillness, aware that he had crossed a threshold without fully realizing it. He was no longer simply being judged. He was being studied. And in that shift, the narrative of humanity had begun to change from something static into something ongoing. The council had not accepted humanity. Not yet. But they had agreed to watch. And in the vast silence between stars, that decision carried more weight than any verdict ever could. Ethan Carter remained in place as the chamber's systems finalized the parameters, knowing that what came next would define more than just him. It would define how an entire galaxy began to see a species that refused to stay finished. The chamber remained still as the final parameters locked into place. But beneath that stillness, something new had begun to take shape. Ethan Carter stood alone at the center of the Galactic Council chamber, yet for the first time, he felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere around him. It was no longer purely observation. It was anticipation. Across the elevated platforms, the alien observers adjusted their focus, their forms casting soft reflections across the polished surface below. Systems activated quietly. Data streams flowed in patterns invisible to the human eye, but deeply felt in the structure of the room itself. Observation sequence will commence shortly, the lead counselor announced. Its voice carried a tone that was no longer purely authoritative. There was something else now. Curiosity, perhaps. Ethan did not respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, grounding himself in the moment. Understood, he said finally. The chamber dimmed slightly as a circular platform emerged from the floor, rising just a few inches. It was minimal, clean, designed for neutral evaluation. Step forward, the counselor instructed. Ethan complied without hesitation. His movements were calm, deliberate, controlled. Each step echoed faintly in the chamber, not loud, but clear enough to be noticed. When he reached the platform, he stopped and stood still, waiting. The air around him felt different now. Not heavier, not lighter, just different. You will now be observed under controlled conditions, the counselor continued. Your responses will be recorded, analyzed, and compared against established behavioral parameters. Ethan nodded once. That sounds fair. A brief pause followed. You accept these conditions without objection? Another counselor asked. Ethan looked up, meeting the voice directly. If you are trying to understand us, he said, then you have to see us as we are when we do not have control over everything. That statement settled into the room like a quiet weight. Not resistance, not defiance, just clarity. One of the counselors tilted slightly, as if recalculating something internally. Another emitted a faint pulse of light that flickered and stabilized. Proceed, the lead counselor finally said. The chamber responded immediately. Subtle changes unfolded. The lighting adjusted. The ambient sound shifted into a lower, steady tone. And then, a projection began to form in the center of the chamber. It was not Earth. Not exactly. It was a constructed environment. A simulation. But one that carried enough familiarity to trigger something within Ethan. He recognized the terrain. The open space. The faint horizon line. It resembled a neutral region on Earth, stripped of population, simplified for observation. Ethan stepped off the platform and into the projection. The ground beneath his feet felt real enough. The air carried a faint temperature that matched a mild afternoon. Around him, the chamber dissolved into the background, replaced by a controlled environment that mirrored the council's design. Initial conditions established, a synthetic voice announced. Subject presence confirmed. Ethan stood quietly, taking in the surroundings. This was no longer just a conversation. It was a test. A demonstration, a moment where observation would turn into interpretation. Somewhere within the chamber, the council watched closely. Not just his actions, but his stillness, his hesitation, his reactions to the unfamiliar environment. What are you looking for? Ethan asked aloud, though he knew the answer might not come immediately. There was a pause. Then the lead counselor's voice responded through the system. Consistency. Ethan nodded slightly. Then watched carefully. He stood in the simulated environment, unmoving for a moment, allowing the observation to begin. Not by force, not by instruction, but by choice. And in that choice, something subtle emerged. Not proof, not conclusion, but something far more important. A beginning. The simulated environment remained still, yet it was no longer empty. Ethan Carter stood at its center, the ground beneath him stable, the air around him quiet, and the invisible eyes of the Galactic Council focused entirely on him. Every detail was being recorded, every movement measured, every silence evaluated. Ethan did not rush to act. Instead, he observed first. His head turned slightly, taking in the constructed horizon, the controlled lighting, the absence of natural chaos. It was clean, too clean, not because it was flawed, but because it was designed to remove uncertainty. Subject has not initiated action, the synthetic voice announced across the chamber. Ethan took a slow step forward, then another. His pace was unhurried, natural, human. Consistency is not about speed, he said calmly. It is about behavior under pressure. He stopped walking and looked down at the ground beneath him. The surface responded faintly, adjusting to his presence. You built this to measure us, he continued, his voice steady. But you are already influencing what you see. In the chamber, a counselor tilted its head. Explain. Ethan lifted his gaze toward the unseen observers. A controlled environment removes variables, he said. But it also removes truth. A brief pause followed. Not resistance. Not correction. Just processing. Ethan crouched slightly, touching the ground. It felt real. Solid. Yet he knew it was not. If you want to understand humanity, he said, you cannot control the conditions that define us. He stood again, letting his hand fall back to his side. Around him, the environment remained stable, but the sense of observation intensified. Then what do you propose? The lead counselor asked. Ethan looked around once more, then answered without hesitation. Let me choose. The words hung in the simulated air. Choose what? Another counselor responded. Ethan took a breath. What to do next? Hey. Pause followed. Longer this time. Not empty, but filled with calculation. You would introduce unpredictability into a controlled test, the counselor stated. Ethan nodded slightly. That is the only way to see how we truly respond. The chamber remained silent for several moments. Then, slowly, a shift occurred. Granted, the lead counselor said at last. Within defined parameters. Ethan did not smile. He did not react outwardly. But internally, something had aligned. Then I will proceed, he said. The environment around him remained unchanged, but the constraints subtly expanded. Not visible, not audible, but present. Ethan closed his eyes for just a moment, centering himself. When he opened them again, his expression was calm, focused, and quietly resolute. He began to walk again, but this time, his direction was not random. It was intentional. Subject is initiating autonomous behavior, the system reported. Around him, the council observed closely, analyzing every decision, every pause, every subtle shift in posture. Ethan stopped at a point within the simulation, then turned slightly, as if addressing an unseen presence. You are not just watching what I do, he said softly. You are learning how we think. A ripple moved through the council. Subtle, measurable. Ethan continued, his voice steady, but carrying something deeper now. And what you are seeing is not perfection. He paused, letting the silence settle. It is effort. The simulated environment remained still, but the weight of his words lingered, spreading quietly through the chamber beyond the simulation itself. And for the first time since the observation began, the council was not just analyzing behavior. They were beginning to question the meaning behind it. The simulated environment held its quiet form, but the energy within the Galactic Council chamber had shifted again. Ethan Carter stood still for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the controlled terrain around him. The system had given him choice, but choice itself carried weight. Every movement he made now mattered in ways that went beyond observation. Behind the layers of simulation, the council watched with increased intensity, not just analyzing, anticipating. Ethan exhaled slowly and began walking forward again, his steps measured and deliberate. The ground beneath him responded subtly, adapting to his pace, the environment adjusting in real time. It was responsive, but not reactive. Designed to observe, not to challenge. Subject is exhibiting continued autonomous behavior, the system announced. Ethan stopped. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just enough to mark intention. Then he spoke, his voice steady. You are still expecting us to behave like a system. In the chamber, a counselor leaned forward slightly. Clarify. Ethan turned his head, as if addressing the space itself. You built this environment to predict us, he said. But humans are not predictable in the way you think. He stepped forward again, then stopped at a new position. We are consistent in our inconsistency. A subtle ripple passed through the observing council. Ethan continued. You look for patterns, for repetition, for outcomes that match your models. He paused, letting the silence stretch. But we do not live inside your models. The lead counselor responded, its voice steady but no longer entirely certain. Your species has demonstrated repeated cycles of deviation. That does not align with stability. Ethan nodded once. Correct. The response was immediate. Unquestioning. and that alone caused a slight shift in the council's perception. Ethan continued, his tone calm but deliberate. But deviation is not failure. He gestured faintly around him. It is how we adapt. The simulation remained stable, yet the energy within it felt different now. Less like a test, more like a dialogue. Adaptation requires instability, another counselor stated. Ethan looked up. It requires freedom. A brief silence followed. Freedom introduces risk, the counselor replied. Ethan gave a slight, knowing nod. Yes. No resistance. No denial. Just acknowledgement. And risk is where growth happens. The words hung in the air. The chamber remained silent, but not passive. The observers were no longer just recording data. They were processing meaning. Ethan turned slightly, as if listening to something beyond the simulation itself. You want to understand us, he said quietly. But you are approaching us like we are a problem to solve. He paused, then added, we are not a problem. A moment of stillness followed. Then he spoke again, softer this time, but with deeper impact. We are a process. In the council chamber, one of the observers emitted a low, steady pulse of light. Another shifted its posture, as if something internal had just aligned differently. Explain, the lead counselor requested. Ethan stopped moving. The simulation remained unchanged around him. Controlled, measured, but his presence within it felt increasingly grounded. A problem has a solution, he said. A process evolves. He looked forward, not directly at any single observer, but at the collective presence watching him. You are not observing the end of humanity. A pause. You are observing its continuation. The chamber grew quieter still. Not empty, not resolved, but deeply attentive. Ethan remained in place, his breathing steady, his posture relaxed. There was no urgency in him. No need to prove anything further. He had not come to convince them, only to be seen. And in that moment, something within the Galactic Council began to shift from observation to something far more significant. Understanding was no longer distant. It had become possible. The simulation remained active, but something fundamental had changed in its tone. The controlled environment no longer felt like a test designed to isolate variables. It felt like a space that was beginning to absorb them. Ethan Carter stood quietly, his presence steady, his posture relaxed, yet alert in a way that was difficult to quantify. Across the Galactic Council chamber, the observers were no longer simply analyzing. They were engaging. Their focus had sharpened, but their perspective had widened. Ethan could feel it in the silence between transmissions, in the subtle shifts of attention that no instrument could fully capture. Continue, the lead counselor said. Its voice carried a depth that suggested something more than protocol. It carried intent. Ethan did not move immediately. He allowed the moment to settle, to exist without interference. Then he spoke. You are still trying to categorize me. His voice was calm, not accusatory, not defensive, just observant. A brief pause followed. Clarify, the counselor responded. Ethan looked forward, his eyes steady, his expression composed. You are measuring my behavior against your understanding of order, he said. But I do not operate within your structure of order. The simulated environment remained unchanged, yet the meaning behind it continued to evolve. Your species demonstrates patterns, another counselor stated. Patterns imply predictability. Ethan nodded slightly. Patterns also imply learning. The statement lingered. Not challenged. Not confirmed. Just present. Learning introduces variability, the counselor replied. Ethan took a slow breath. Yes. He did not argue. He did not elaborate. The simplicity of his response carried weight. Then your species cannot be relied upon for consistency, the counselor continued. Ethan shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself more firmly within the simulation. We are not consistent in the way you expect, he said, but we are consistent in what matters. The council fell into a brief silence, not confusion, not agreement, something closer to recalibration. Ethan continued. We protect what we value. A subtle pulse moved through the chamber. Even at cost? The lead counselor asked. Ethan did not hesitate. Yes. The response was immediate. Clear. Undeniable. Then your behavior is not logical, another counselor stated. Ethan exhaled softly. It is not meant to be. He looked around the simulation once more, taking in the controlled environment that surrounded him. Logic alone does not define a species, he said. It only defines its tools. A faint shift passed through the observing council. The lead counselor remained silent for a moment longer than before. Then it spoke again. If not logic, then what defines your species? Ethan paused. The question was deeper than the others. Not a challenge. A search. He considered his answer carefully, not because it needed to be perfect, but because it needed to be true. Choice, he said. The word was simple, direct, yet it carried an entire framework within it. Choice introduces uncertainty, the counselor responded. Ethan nodded. Yes. Another pause followed. And yet, Ethan continued, that uncertainty is where meaning exists. The chamber grew still, not empty, but focused. Ethan stood quietly, allowing his words to settle into the space around him. Then he added, softly but firmly, without choice, there is no responsibility. The simulation remained unchanged, but its purpose had shifted. It was no longer just observing behavior. It was confronting perspective. The council had entered this observation seeking patterns, predictability, and consistency. But what they were encountering now was something different. Something that did not fit within their frameworks, yet could not be dismissed. Ethan remained still, his breathing calm, his presence grounded. He had not come to prove anything. But in his stillness, something undeniable had taken shape. Humanity was not being defined by what it avoided, but by what it chose to face. And in that realization, the Galactic Council was no longer merely observing a subject. They were beginning to witness a perspective that could not be reduced, only understood. The simulated environment began to fade in subtle ways, not disappearing, but transitioning. The clean horizon softened. The air felt less constrained. The Galactic Council chamber remained in place, yet its attention shifted into a quieter, more reflective state. Ethan Carter stood at the center of the simulation, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, but something in the atmosphere had resolved. Not completed, not concluded, but acknowledged. End observation cycle, the lead counselor finally said. The words were not abrupt. They were deliberate, measured. The simulation responded immediately. The horizon stabilized. The lighting adjusted. The environment paused in a state of neutral equilibrium. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, then slowly relaxed his stance. He did not move toward the center. He did not step away. He simply existed within the space, no longer under evaluation, yet still observed. What have you concluded? The counselor asked. The question carried more weight than any before it. Ethan considered the moment carefully, not because he needed time to answer, but because the answer mattered in a way that extended beyond the simulation. He looked toward the unseen presence of the council and spoke clearly. You have not concluded anything yet. A brief silence followed. Explain, the counselor responded. Ethan nodded slightly. You have gathered data, he said. You have analyzed behavior. You have observed patterns, deviations, responses. He paused. But understanding does not come from observation alone. The chamber remained still. Then what is required? Another counselor asked. Ethan took a slow breath. Context, he said, and time. The statement settled into the space between them. Not as an argument, not as a challenge, but as a principle. Your evaluation assumes that a moment can define a species, Ethan continued. But a moment is only a fragment of a larger story. The council processed his words in silence. If a species cannot be defined in a single moment, the lead counselor said, then how is it to be understood? Ethan met the question directly. By witnessing its progression. A pause followed. Progression requires continuity, the counselor replied. Ethan nodded. Exactly. The answer was simple, but its implications were not. Then your species must be observed over extended cycles, another counselor stated. Ethan allowed a faint, almost imperceptible acknowledgement. Yes. The simulation remained stable, but its purpose had shifted once more. It was no longer just a controlled observation. It was becoming a point of reference, a beginning of something larger. And in that time, Ethan added, you will see more than patterns. He looked out into the space around him. You will see growth. The word carried weight, not as a prediction, but as an expectation. Growth is not guaranteed, the counselor responded. Ethan agreed immediately. No, he said. It is not. A brief silence followed. Then why pursue it? The counselor asked. Ethan's expression remained calm, his voice steady. Because it is what we choose. The simplicity of the answer contrasted with its depth. It was not a calculation. It was not a strategy. It was a direction. The chamber remained quiet for several moments. Not in uncertainty, but in reflection. Then the lead counselor spoke once more. Your perspective has been noted. Ethan gave a small, respectful nod. And your observation has only just begun. The simulation began to recede further, not collapsing, but concluding its current cycle. Ethan remained in place as the environment gently transitioned back toward its base state. This concludes the initial assessment phase, the system announced. Ethan did not speak. He simply stood still as the space around him stabilized. In the Galactic Council chamber, the observers remained silent. Not because they had nothing to say, but because what they had witnessed could not be summarized easily. The human had not proven superiority. He had not demonstrated dominance. He had done something far more subtle. He had introduced perspective. And in doing so, he had changed the nature of the observation itself. The council had come to study a species. But what they were beginning to realize was that they had encountered something that could not be fully measured by observation alone. It required participation. It required time. And above all, it required the willingness to understand without control. Ethan Carter stood quietly as the simulation fully disengaged, his presence steady, his purpose unchanged. He had not arrived to be defined. He had arrived to be understood. And somewhere beyond the boundaries of that chamber, a new question had begun to take shape. Not about what humanity was, but about what it could become.